Okay, so let's do chapter number 11. This is a very short chapter. So I'm putting on this video, and I'm gonna explain some problem which will take us through the things that I want you to understand for your exams and for your quiz, right? So let's talk about this chapter. This is about standards, creating standards, okay? And I'm sure you'll pick up this information because the concepts are coming from the past. So um, what we the main idea here that I want you to learn is the standard costs. What is standard costs? Okay, and how do we create standards for to calculate something called variances? Okay, so how to distinguish between standards and budget. So what you did was like total dollars for the department, direct material cost for the department, for the firm, for the company, right? But here what we are looking about is standard of a unit of work. So a unit of work, for example, if you're talking about what it costs for a plane to fly from Reading to New York, a certain size plane, right? So we know that the fuel cost will be so much. There will be um, a certain costs related to other airport charges, but you will have some standard costs. That standard is something that you can compare with. And when there's an actual flight, you can compare. Okay, one flight to of from Reading to New York. That's the standard cost should be, but what is the actual cost? So now we are not talking about the bigger company or the bigger department or the toll. We are just talking about one unit of work done. Okay, and that can be different for different companies. So if you are a company that produces lamp, one table lamp of this size and this design, how much it should cost to produce that lamp. So let's say if it should cost $50, then but your actual is $70, then there's some worry, right? So that's the idea. um, the standard cost helps a company to determine some kind of a efficiency, right? We want to kind of tell our employees who are working on producing these products that you should be cost conscious, because if you are too slow or inefficient and there's a lot of wastage, as management we better have a good management control, right? Planning and control, idea of planning and control. And so if you're a company that produces shoes, and you set price, for example, in this case it's $75. um, your cost standard cost for producing such shoe may be $60. um, Actual costs may be higher or lower than that, right? Just to produce one pair of shoe. So now standard costs, I just wanted to get you, we are now getting into looking at a more detailed level, right? We wanna see how much work was done so that we can somehow grab, if there is an inefficient decisions in the company, we can somehow capture those inefficiencies, and that's why it's called exception reports. where we put actual on one side and we put standard on one side, and the variance is the difference. So this is the idea. We want to know if our company is meeting the standards that are out there in the market. Those standards are created by management. A lot of people get involved in that. Sometimes you have to hire consultants, and they come and they can tell you, a company that, for the standard cost of producing this watch should be, let's say, $500, right? And these engineers may have 30 years of experience. These consultants, right? They have 30 years of experience working on these watches. They know the industry. They know the cost, and those are the people that help, including the management of that company, to determine what the standard cost should be, okay, of a single item. So now, how to produce these standard costs? One way is to produce ideal standards, right? Ideal is something like optimum level of performance. So one person, of course, you will find one person among us who's very efficient, you know, doesn't need much breaks, doesn't have, doesn't, require too much social time, that. And so if you take that ideal sort of a person, a worker, that may not be fair to a normal standard, right? So a normal standard is something where your performance, it represents efficient, but it expects certain operating conditions. Like, for example, an employee must usually need breaks. Sometimes they need to call their families, have a little social time, right? Talk to their friends. So whenever we create standards, it is not ideal standards that we are trying to attain. It is normal standards. Some firms that try to attain ideal usually pay a heavy price for that, because their employees usually end up leaving because there's too much pressure on them to achieve ideal standards, right? So we want standards that are rigorous but attainable. So there's a fine, sort of fine line here. We don't want to push employees to an ideal or optimum level, okay? And so, for example, this is a nice question. Most companies that use standards set them at optimum level, ideal level. So we know we don't want optimum or ideal level. Normal level, that looks right? And number D is practical level. Now, practical level sounds a little sort of a fishy answer. Okay, so the fishy answer means, what I'm trying to say is that what is practical? But a normal is something like an average. So that has much more meaningful idea than a practical. So practical for some may be different. So a normal seems a right answer. Let's look at further into this case study. So how do we create these standards? Okay, so for example, if you're manufacturing a product, you have three type of costs, right? This is all coming from earlier chapters: direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So let's create a standard. So I mean, these slides are good for conceptual questions. So let's talk about what should be a sort of normal standard. What should be a standard cost for direct material? What kind of ideas go into such thinking? So whenever we talk about the price standard, direct material price standard, we are talking about the price of purchase. And of course, there in a normal under normal circumstances, there's always, whenever you purchase item, there's always discounts, right? So you got to consider those discounts in a standard, in a price standard, right? And when you buy these direct material, you have to ship them, get them to to the company's location, and so there are freight charges, and that becomes part of the direct material. And also, when you get them, there's a receiving cost and a handling cost. You need to store them somewhere. You need to get people to receive them, and there is a cost for it. So you include all that, and so the standard direct materials price per pound is $3. So it's the ideas that are required. You cannot ignore these other type of costs when you're thinking about standards. Okay, so how about the materials, direct materials quantity standard? So of course, you for creating a unit, right, to produce a unit, you need certain required pounds of quantity. But then, um, if you're thinking about under normal conditions, right, there's sometime there's you have to consider some wastage, right? You cannot have a perfect production where there's no wastage. So if you let that allowance for wastage, which is 0.04 pounds, these numbers just hypothetical. It's these ideas. And then you should also have create an allowance for spoilage. Sometimes things are not perfect. So if you have 20 employees on working on these material, and some of those materials, you find that they did get spoiled, and this is a normal part of operations. You will get spoilage of these materials, under normal expectation. So if you include all those ideas into it, then that's the standard direct material. So, but if you just include the required material and think there will never be a wastage and no spoilage, that's what we don't want in a standard direct material quantity standard, right? So we want to include those ideas. So here's another multiple choice. The direct materials price standard should include an amount for all of the following except, so remember, this is price standard. Receiving costs, price standard was the price, the discounts, the receiving, the storing, the handling, right? The receiving, storing, handling is all included in the price standard. The normal spoilage cost was spoilage quantity was included in the, if you remember, it was included in the direct materials quantity standard, not in the price standard. But in the price standard, we had freight and handling. So that is why answer is part D, because spoilage cost does not relate to price standard. It relates to quantity standard. Okay, so now let's talk about the direct labor. Direct labor standard, when you hire an employee, right? You have to pay them an hourly wage. Plus, you also have to consider if there is some kind of adjustment that you have to, cost of living adjustment that you have to do, because inflation changes, right? Inflation has an impact. So you have to worry about that adjustment. You have to also think about the payroll taxes that are involved. You also have to think about their vacation, their other benefits like medical, their dental, and all that. Those benefits have a cost on each hour of work that they do. So you cannot ignore those costs when you're thinking about a standard direct labor rate per hour. So just putting only the hourly rate is not gonna work. And that's what we mean by standards. For the quantity, so if you are an employee, you work, the actual production time is 1.5 hours that the employee really works, right? The rest of the time, an employee sorry about that, also needs some rest, and also needs to do some cleanup, and also needs to set up as well, and sometimes there's just a downtime, right? Things, machines sometimes just don't work, and you need to have a time where a certain percentage of that hour on a normal basis, right, on an expected basis, a certain percentage of that there will be no work done during that. That's a downtime time, right? So it takes, for every 1 hour quantity to produce this labor, you need 2 hours of labor. So whenever you create standards, you have to think about those things that go wrong in under normal circumstances, and you can create ideal standards. Okay, that's what I mean. For manufacturing overhead, which I'm not emphasizing too much, you have we have talked about this in the previous chapter. How do you create manufacturing costs? We take the budgeted overhead, annual budgeted cost, divided by the expected standard activity index, which can be standard direct labor hours or standard machine hours. So it's basically expected divided by expected, right? Total expected overhead divided by total, to get some kind of a standard for manufacturing overhead. So that's standard predetermined overhead rate we have talked about in previous chapter. So I'm just not emphasizing too much of this, but I'll focus more on the direct material standards and the direct labor standards. Okay, so now I'm gonna do a problem from the next slides, and I want you to focus on this for with the mind that your final exam and your quiz. These are, beside conceptual questions, this is where I plan to emphasize. Thank you.